Welcome back. It's time for another episode of CRM Radio. Today, brought to you by the good folks at Goldmine, the people who first brought CRM to all of our attentions and still continue to make it one of the leading CRMs out there today. With one of the geniuses that works over there at Goldmine, Stacy Gentile. Hey, Stacy.
Hey, how's it going, Paul?
I'm good. Are you one of the official geniuses, or are you just the one unrecognized talent there?
Probably unrecognized. Maybe I should go off the rails today, and we should just discuss the Mueller report.
Oh, boy.
I can guarantee that our guest today is going to be much more exciting than reading the 600 pages of the Mueller report.
I hope so.
Today's goal, like I said, is to make it more exciting than the Mueller report.
I think you can do that.
We can try. So today's guest, we got Colleen Francis. Colleen is a well-known best-selling author. She's a sales consultant, and she's a public speaker who gives keynotes and is even in the Speaker Hall of Fame.
I didn't know there was a Speaker Hall of Fame.
There is. Okay. Actually, many of our guests are in it.
Well, there you go. Well,
yes.
I look forward even more eagerly now to hearing what she has to say.
Colleen, it's wonderful to have you.
I'm also Canadian, so I'm pleading the fifth on all the Robert Mueller.
Oh, come on. You don't get off that easy.
It's great to be here.
Well, it's nice to have you. So when you get in the Speaking Hall of Fame, do they give you a busk like getting the NFL Hall of Fame? I always forget to ask that question. Did you have to pose for that, or do you get one of your own, like an Oscar?
I have a plaque. Actually, I have two plaques. I'm looking at them right now.
Oh, very, very cool. So, Colleen, tell us a little bit about yourself. What kind of crazy path did you take to get where you are, and what are you seeing going on in the marketplace?
You know, it's not all that crazy a path. I was one of those kids who grew up in a selling environment. I laugh. You know, when I had a professional development day at school, in elementary school, my mom used to send me out with my dad, and he was a paper and envelope salesman for Kilroy, Canada Envelope, and companies like that, and I made sales calls with him. I think he used me as one of those baby needs a new pair of shoes kind of sales coaches. You know, but interestingly, I never thought of sales as a bad thing. I was, again, one of those kids, I think because of my dad, I had to go door to door to sell the chocolates or the wrapping paper, spices, poinsettias, whatever it was we were selling to go to band camp and soccer camp. He didn't take that stuff to school, to his work with him. So it was easy for me to get into sales after I graduated from university. And that's all I've ever done from a career perspective is sell. And I've seen a lot of evolution in selling, because if you can imagine, when I was 5, traveling with my dad, he had a payphone. He had to call the office to see if anyone had called for him. There was, it was a huge excitement in our house when a pager, actually it wasn't even called a pager back then. I think he called it a beeper. A beeper came into the office.
That's right. Back in the old days when you used to get the Glengarry leads in the big pink stack, right? With the bow on them.
Exactly. I always used to laugh because it was so exciting. My dad's beeper would go off, but it would just beep. And then you'd have to stop and call the office to find out why they were beeping him.
Maybe we should go back to those days, because I think it creates like a Pavlovian response, right? When you get that ding or that chime. Remember back in the old days of AOL when you got mail, you're like, ooh, somebody sent me something.
It's exciting.
Maybe that's what salespeople need. Or maybe shock collars. I don't know. One or the other. Maybe both.
Well, every time there is a new technology, people do tend to respond that way. I still think that's why one of the reasons why things like LinkedIn have such a higher rate of response in terms of emails, because people still are thinking, ooh, I got a LinkedIn request. I better respond. It's different from email.
I'm unfamiliar with LinkedIn. What is that? Oh, good old LinkedIn. So your consulting approach is a little unique in the world of sales, Colleen. Can you tell us about it? Like because you developed like a radar system with 4 quadrants, right?
Yes, I did. So our sales radar, what I noticed when I wrote Nonstop Sales Boom is that a lot of salespeople were creating this abnormal boom bust cycle in their selling year, because they either closed or they opened a business. They seem to be binary. They could only do one at a time. They'd get so excited about closing all the business in their pipeline that they would stop prospecting, and then the pipeline would dry up, and so they'd have to prospect for a number of months, and they'd close no business, and they'd go through these swings. It wasn't seasonally based. It was self-inflicted. And so we started to look using Sales Radar, we started to realize that it wasn't a linear process, that salespeople at all times needed to look at their client base a little bit more holistically and say, okay, I may be closing a new piece of business here, but how can I be using my existing customers to spot opportunities in other places? And if I can get them to start thinking about a sort of a 360 or a radar model in terms of where opportunities are coming from, then they can keep their pipelines consistently filled and they can grow their business in a consistent manner instead of this high swings and lows.
So can you expand on when you're doing your consulting work, probably more so than the speaking stuff, because when you're doing consulting, you're kind of in the weeds and you're there working with people in the trenches in the battlefield. Where do most companies fall on that sales radar when you're working with them, and what some of the observations that you see, and how can they get maybe in from that quadrant to the better quadrant?
I find that most companies don't pay attention to the connection between opportunity creation and opportunity closing. So all they track are lagging indicator KPIs, which is the close. So most companies take a look and they say, are you hitting your close number? What's there to close? But they don't actually pay attention to the leading indicator KPIs, which are, is the sales rep doing the things they need to do on a regular basis to build the right number of leads to get to that close? When I listen to coaching calls, for example, when I'm starting a consulting job, I hear sales managers say, you're not hitting your target, you need to close more deals. And then it ends. Okay.
Right. Full stop. Do better.
You're not winning enough hockey games, you need to score more goals. I mean, it's useless information. And so then the company will say things like, well, the guys aren't closing enough deals, so they need to create more opportunities. So everyone has to create 10 new opportunities a month. Well, is 10 the right number? No one does the math to say, is 10 overkill or is it not enough? 10 of what kind of deals? What's the easiest way to find those opportunities? What does a good quality opportunity look like? No one's paying attention to see how long those opportunities take to close and how we can shorten them. I shouldn't say nobody, the bulk of my customers when I'm starting out. So what they're only paying attention to the number at the end and not the process for getting there. And that's where I think they fail, is when they start paying attention to the front end of that pipeline, then we can do some calculations to find out how they can speed up the close, how they can shorten the cycle time, how they can improve the quality of the lead and drive a higher dollar value into every sale.
I have to make a small disclaimer here. I'm a recovering consultant myself. So I've walked into many of those meetings myself, and I think what you're mentioning is where the businesses might go wrong is they're not being intentional enough about the revenue, right? Because when you go into an organization, one of the first things I used to do is I'd say, let's pull out the P&L and take a look at it. I'm going to show you your number one problem. I'd say, look at all these lines of cost. If our goal was to come into this company and cut out 10 to 20% of your cost, you could easily do it because you've got 600 lines on this P&L of cost. Now, if I said, let's grow the revenue by 10 to 20%, you'd be mystified because you have one line. It just says revenue. Might as well say mystery money, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how can companies be more intentional about their sales? What do you recommend? What do you see? Where are perhaps some of the no-brainer things or challenge things that your clients bring up when you tell them that?
Well, the first thing we do is the sales math. So the first thing we do, and if they don't have their own numbers, because with a client this week where they don't know their closing ratios, then we just use averages. So the first place we start is to say, okay, let's take a look at what somebody's sales goal is, what the average size new piece of business is, how long it takes to close on average. If you don't know, then we'll use some averages based on your industry, and the closing or the conversion averages between a qualified opportunity, and then a lead and an opportunity. And we'll work out then roughly how many leads need to be in the pipeline on any given month in order for them to close the right amount of business. And we'll start tracking that and measuring it against their actual conversion ratios. So that's the first place I start, because you got to start with that science. Then we take a look at the art and say, okay, how do we improve this? Because, sometimes these numbers that are totally unrealistic, like one poor guy we were working with at an energy company, he's like, but I have to create 147 opportunities a week. I'm like, okay, well, that's not going to happen. So poor kid, it was because his average his average deal size was super small compared to everyone else's. So we said, okay, so how do we move your deal size from 500 to 1,500? Or how do we move your opportunity creation from brand new to selling more to existing customers or getting referrals? So we start to play with the levers where we know you can drive the biggest velocity increase. And that velocity increase can come from increasing the deal size, improving the conversion ratio by working with referrals or existing customers, or increasing the speed in which they're closing.
Again, when you're talking to these executives, where are some of the challenge or maybe pushback points when you bring those kind of things up? What are they agreeing to easily, and what are they like, pull back on the rein?
They agree to it all easily if they have the data. Okay, so that's the first thing. Some companies just don't have the data because they're still not tracking it in a CRM. I was working with a global plastics manufacturer, $350 to $500 million a year. No CRM. We built them a CRM in Excel because they wouldn't invest in buying off-the-shelf software. It was crazy. Sometimes I get resistance on the data because we don't have the data, but generally nobody resists to the plan. Where they resist is in the coaching, the implementation. So the resistance comes when I hold the sales manager accountable and say, okay, we now need to have coaching calls and sales meetings that are driven from the evidence based on the data as opposed to just what your gut feel is or what you want to talk about in this meeting.
That's an interesting point, because if you don't have the data, it's kind of hard to understand where it is that you're going, right? Or even where you've been.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. There's a lot of companies that don't have that data. I mean, there's a lot of salespeople who just still base their sales on what they think is going to happen or what they hope is going to happen. The resistance comes when we try to create a systematic approach for a process. You know, here's stage 1, here's stage 2, here's stage 3, here are the verifiers so that everyone's singing by the same song sheet. Like, create a playbook and say you don't move it to stage 2 until these things are done. Sometimes the reps come back and think that's overly bureaucratic. With CRM systems, they come back and say, you only want me to put this data in so that you have oversight or you can see where I am or you can see what I'm doing. They don't see it as a productivity tool, so there's some resistance in that. They see it as an admin tool. And then coaching. I honestly think that that's the big issue that most organizations have, is they just have poor sales coaching methodology with their managers.
We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll pick that up. We'll talk about sales coaching, and then I want to talk about the word sales. Is that even the right word anymore? So we'll come back to that on the flip side. Take it away, Paul. Quick commercial break.
We know you rely on your CRM system, and it's usually a love-hate relationship. Most CRM systems, well, let's face it, they're expensive. They're hard to understand. People don't use them properly. And you're probably paying for features that you don't even want. If that's your case, then maybe it's time to simplify. It's time to get more from your CRM. Why don't you go back to the original? Trust Goldmine. We help pioneer the industry, after all. Goldmine CRM is, well, it's simple, it's affordable, and it's proven. If all those sound appealing to you, if you're just tired of the CRM headaches that you're getting from trying to implement something that's just too complicated, too expensive, and too much for you to figure out, then why not go back to the original? Visit Goldmine today, goldmine.com. All right, let's pick it back up with Stacy and his guest.
My guest, Colleen Francis. All right, where we left off, Colleen, we were going to talk about, and you notice I have the same accent that you do because I'm from northern Wisconsin, which is almost Canada. It's just as cold. We were going to talk about sales coaching inside the organization, but I want to kind of lead into that with a bigger question about the disruptiveness that's been happening in sales maybe over the last 5 or 10 years. It seems like everything's kind of been flipped on its head a little bit. And often I wonder if sales is even an accurate term anymore because the buyer side processes have changed so much, and they've been able to put up barriers against salespeople. I think everybody rejects the notion and the idea of being sold anything. So what are your thoughts on that? Is sales even the right word anymore?
It's a great question. because we're not so much in a selling environment as we are in a buying environment. And I see salespeople, the best salespeople I work with, focus on facilitating a buying process as opposed to creating a sales process. So the vernacular sales it's really like an internal term because we don't know what else to call it. I mean, we're revenue generators, right? But buyers have so much more information available to them, so much more process available to them. They have so many more ways to avoid talking to us, and they use them at great length, that once we get engaged, it's a matter of figuring out what the buyer knows already and facilitating a discussion with them and their colleagues around how our product and solution fits into what they're looking for.
Given all those changes, and you were just mentioning how important, or maybe the most important thing inside of the organization is the ability to be a sales leader and be a coach, that's getting a lot more challenging now, I think, because of everything that we just talked about, even in the last 15, 20 minutes, is everything's been so disrupted. Mm-hmm. How is it that sales leaders and sales coaches, even external ones that come into organizations, are able to deal with all these changes and provide good counsel?
It's really interesting to watch because I find that if the sales leaders or sales coaches have been around a long time and have been selling since the 70s or the 80s or maybe even the 90s, if they're not careful, they get into a mindset where they say, it worked for me this way, so just do it the way I did it, or this has always worked, or this is the way I did it. And they get sort of stuck in that success mindset of it worked that way before, so it should work this way again. And the problem with that is it might still be working. Let's take cold calling, for example. So here's a sales leader. He reached out to me. He said, I don't understand why I can't get someone to do this work for me. 50 cold calls a day and 25 cold emails to set up 5 meetings. Well, the ratios are completely out of whack. 10 years ago, you would have made 50 cold calls and got 5 meetings. Now this guy is suggesting 50 a day for 3 months, for 60 days. That's 3,000 calls to get 5 meetings. I have an idea why no one wants this job.
Right. Well, actually, I think it's probably even worse than that, because now a lot of technology has gotten in there where they got auto dialers. They usually, in most organizations, expect SDRs, or the sales development reps, which is a new term for cold callers, especially if, they'll hit up people who download white papers and those kind of things. They expect them to make 100 dials a day, probably 250, 300 with the auto dialers. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah. It is. It's absolutely insane. Yet his mindset is it still works because it's still getting him the end result he wants, which are those 5 meetings. But what he's failing to understand is the leading indicators are so terrible, it's not working anymore. He needs a new approach. The best sales leaders I work with are really open-minded to this new approach. What they're doing is they're not just looking at the efficiency, but they're looking at the effectiveness. What's the best person doing, and how do we move that ratio to be better? How do we get our customers to respond, in 5 calls instead of 50 calls? What kinds of tools can we be using? What is the top person in our organization doing?
Colleen, as we're kind of ending the back stretch here on the podcast program, what is the single best piece of advice you could give to those SMB executives who are listening today? Like, if you just had to deliver that one thing, that tip that's going to help them hit that fastball over the center field wall when they go back and after listening to this and do whatever it was they were doing, what is that golden nugget?
Pay attention to the metrics. Track the data religiously and watch where it's trending on an individual basis, not just a company basis, and see who is doing better with less effort, who's closing more deals faster, who's closing more deals in a shorter period of time or with a better ratio. Find out what that person is doing, because they're probably adapting to the new buying process and adopting new technology that can make the rest of the team successful.
Right. And then replicate it. Find out a way to replicate it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And you replicate it by coaching those top performers and getting them to make conscious what they're doing unconsciously. My belief is that it doesn't matter that you know that person's good. It matters that you know why they are good, because then you can leverage it and replicate it.
Exactly. So, Colleen, how can people get a hold of you? And do you have any current promotions or new books that you're trying to put out in the marketplace? What do you got going on that's hot and new?
I am writing a new book. Yes,
Awesome.
absolutely. So I'm in the throes of some initial editing on my new book, which will be called Right on the Money. You can get a hold of me anywhere. I am online. Ubiquitous is what I say. Colleen Francis. You can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook. My website, engageselling.com, ColleenFrancis.tv if you like videos.
Yeah. And it's Francis, Francis.
It is, yes.
Perfect. So that's a great way for people to get a hold of you. Well, Colleen, it was great having you on a little program today, and we hope to have you back again soon.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
Awesome. Take care.
You too.
You've been listening to another episode of CRM Radio Today, right here on the Funnel Radio Network for at-work listeners like you.